It was an ordinary Tuesday morning in a bustling courthouse, the kind of place where lives were altered and futures decided with the swing of a gavel. The air was heavy with tension, as often was, the weight of justice pressing down on everyone inside. People shuffled through the long corridors, some nervous, others resigned, as they waited for their names to be called. Among them was Janice Carter, a black woman in her late 30s, sitting quietly on one of the wooden benches, dressed in a crisp gray suit and carrying herself with an air of quiet confidence. She blended in seamlessly with the crowd, or so it seemed. Judge Harold Whitman presided over Courtroom 5. Known for his stern demeanor and sharp tongue, he had a reputation for running his courtroom with an iron fist. His rulings were swift, his judgments often unyielding, and his biases, though subtle to some, were an open secret among the court regulars. To many, he represented the harsh and often unequal face of justice, especially for those who didn't look like him. Today, Judge Whitman was in one of his usual moods, irritated by the number of cases on his docket and the seemingly endless stream of defendants before him. Janice's case was next. The courtroom fell silent as her name was called. She rose gracefully, clutching a folder of documents in her hand, and approached the podium. Her every step was measured, her expression unreadable. On the surface, she looked like any other citizen defending herself against a minor infraction. But there was something about her presence that commanded attention, a quiet power that most in the room didn't yet understand. Judge Whitman glanced down at her from the bench, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he scanned the papers in front of him. His tone, cold and curt, filled the room as he began to speak. "Miss Carter, you are here today to address a parking violation that has escalated into a significant fine due to failure to pay on time. Is that correct?" Janice nodded politely, her voice steady as she replied, "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge's expression hardened. "I see you filed a motion to dismiss the fine, citing improper notification as the reason. Let me tell you something, Miss Carter. In this courtroom, personal responsibility matters. Excuses don't fly here." Janice remained calm, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "With respect, Your Honor, I have evidence that the notice was never delivered to my address. I'd like the opportunity to present it." Judge Whitman sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair as if her request was a personal affront. "Evidence or not, this isn't the first time I've heard this kind of story. It's always someone else's fault, isn't it?" His words were laden with condescension, the unspoken implication hanging thick in the air. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, the tension palpable. Janice didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her folder with deliberate care, pulling out a neatly organized stack of documents. "Your Honor, if I may." But before she could finish, the judge cut her off. "Ms. Carter, this is a simple matter. You were fined. You didn't pay. Now, you're here wasting this court's time with technicalities." His voice grew sharper, his frustration evident. "Frankly, I'm inclined to double your fine for the trouble." The air seemed to leave the room as his words sank in. Janice's calm demeanor didn't waver, though her eyes locked onto his with a quiet intensity. For a moment, the courtroom felt frozen, the balance of power hanging in a delicate equilibrium. And then, something shifted. "Your Honor," Janice said, her voice unwavering but now carrying an unmistakable edge, "I would caution you to tread carefully with your remarks. You see, I am not just here as a defendant. I am also the chief prosecutor for this district." The room erupted in whispers, the revelation sending shockwaves through everyone present. Judge Whitman's face turned an unnatural shade of pale, his jaw tightening as he stared down at her, clearly blindsided. Janice's composed exterior remained intact, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes, a fire that spoke of battles fought and won, of someone who had worked twice as hard for half as much, and of someone who was no stranger to standing up to men like him. The judge fumbled for words, his once commanding presence suddenly faltering. But before he could regain control, Janice leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a level that was both calm and devastatingly firm. "And as the chief prosecutor, I am well aware of the standards required in this courtroom, standards that I intend to hold you accountable to, starting now." The courtroom fell silent once more, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Judge Whitman's gavel sat untouched on his bench, his authority momentarily stripped away. All eyes were on Janice, the so-called defendant who had just turned the tables in spectacular fashion. What would happen next was anyone's guess, but one thing was certain. This was no ordinary case, and Janice Carter was no ordinary woman. The stage was set for a showdown that would challenge not just the judge's authority, but the very system he represented. The tension in the room was electric, the outcome uncertain. And as Janice stood there, calm and resolute, it became clear that this was only the beginning of a story that would leave no one untouched. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. It was the kind of silence that came not from a lack of noise, but from a collective disbelief that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. Every eye was on Judge Whitman, the man who just moments ago had wielded his authority like a sword, now rendered momentarily powerless. He blinked, his lips pressing together in a thin, tight line as if searching for the right words to reassert control. Janice, on the other hand, stood with an unshakable calm. Her posture was perfect, her hands relaxed, and her eyes never left the judge's face. It was clear she was no stranger to high-stakes situations. The courtroom clerk, who had been busily typing minutes earlier, now sat frozen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she glanced nervously between Janice and the judge. Even the bailiff, a stoic man who rarely reacted to the drama unfolding in court, stood a little straighter, his expression betraying a flicker of surprise. For a moment, Judge Whitman's voice failed him. The weight of Janice's declaration hit him like a freight train. Chief prosecutor. The words echoed in his mind, carrying implications he couldn't ignore. His mind raced to piece together what this meant, and more importantly, how he could salvage the situation without losing face. His entire career had been built on projecting authority, and yet, in just a few words, this woman had managed to shake the very foundation of his control. Clearing his throat, he finally spoke, though his voice lacked its usual edge. "Ms. Carter, Chief Prosecutor Carter, this court operates under the principle of impartiality. Your position does not grant you any special privileges here." Janice tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Of course, Your Honor. I wouldn't expect otherwise. I'm here as a private citizen, and I intend to be treated as such. That said, I also expect the same standard of fairness and professionalism this court is bound to uphold. Nothing more, nothing less." Her words were measured, deliberate, and laced with just enough weight to remind everyone listening that she was not someone to be underestimated. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a few people exchanging glances as if to say, "Is this really happening?" But Janice's calm exterior masked the whirlwind of emotions swelling inside her. She had not come to court today expecting to reveal her identity, but Whitman's tone, his blatant dismissal, and the thinly veiled condescension in his words had pushed her to a breaking point. It wasn't just about the parking fine anymore, it was about principle. And if there was one thing Janice Carter refused to compromise on, it was standing up for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. The truth was, Janice's journey to becoming chief prosecutor hadn't been an easy one. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, she had seen firsthand the struggles of her community. Her mother, a school teacher, and her father, a factory worker, had instilled in her the values of hard work and integrity. But they had also taught her something else, something far more important. They taught her to recognize injustice and to fight it with everything she had. As a young girl, Janice had spent countless afternoons in the library, poring over books on law and civil rights. She dreamed of becoming a lawyer, not for the prestige, but to make a difference. And when she eventually earned her law degree, she dedicated her career to doing just that. Over the years, she had earned a reputation as a fierce advocate for justice, unafraid to take on cases others deemed too difficult or controversial. Her appointment as chief prosecutor had been a testament to her tireless efforts, but it hadn't come without its challenges. There had been people like Judge Whitman at every step of her journey, people who doubted her, dismissed her, or tried to stand in her way. She had learned to navigate their biases with grace, but she had also learned to stand her ground when it mattered most. And today, in this courtroom, was no exception. As Whitman regained his composure, his tone shifted slightly, though his annoyance was still evident. "Very well, Ms. Carter. If you have evidence to support your claim, present it now. But I remind you, this is a court of law, not a stage for grandstanding." Janice remained unfazed. She reached into her folder and pulled out a series of neatly organized documents, handing them to the bailiff, who delivered them to the judge. "These are records from the post office confirming that the notice was never delivered to my address," she explained. "Additionally, I've included proof of payment for the original fine, which was made well before any late fees were added. The mix-up appears to have occurred due to an administrative error." Whitman scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. But Janice knew better than to mistake his silence for agreement. He was calculating, weighing his options, and trying to determine how best to proceed without further undermining his authority. Meanwhile, the tension in the courtroom continued to build. The people in the gallery, most of whom had come for their own cases, were now fully invested in the unfolding drama. To them, Janice was more than just a woman fighting a parking fine. She was a symbol of resilience, someone who dared to stand up to power and demand accountability. And in a system that often felt stacked against them, that was something worth rooting for. As Whitman flipped through the pages, his frown deepened. The evidence was clear, irrefutable even. But admitting as much would mean conceding that he had been wrong, a prospect he clearly found unpalatable. He set the documents aside, his gaze returning to Janice. "Well, Miss Carter," he began, his tone still clipped but now tinged with a forced neutrality. "It appears there may have been some irregularities in the processing of this case. I will take your evidence under advisement and render a decision shortly." Janice inclined her head slightly, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and quiet defiance. "Thank you, Anna," she said, her voice steady. But even as she spoke, she knew this wasn't over. Whitman's reluctance to admit fault was evident, and she had no doubt he would try to find a way to save face. The question was, how far would he go? And more importantly, what would it cost him? As she returned to her seat, the whispers in the gallery grew louder, a mix of admiration and curiosity. Who was this woman, they seemed to wonder, who had dared to challenge the judge and refused to back down? Janice kept her gaze forward, her expression composed, but her mind was racing. She had faced challenges like this before, but something about today felt different. The stakes were higher, the scrutiny more intense. And while she had no intention of backing down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. For now, all she could do was wait for Whitman's decision, for the fallout that was sure to come, and for the next move in a game that had only just begun. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that only heightened the tension rather than dispelled it. Janice returned to her seat, her heart steady but her mind racing. She had been in enough legal battles to recognize when someone was grasping at straws, and Judge Whitman's reaction was a textbook case. He was cornered, but she knew that didn't mean he would relent. Men like him never did, not without a fight. As she waited for the next move, her thoughts drifted to the chain of events that had brought her here. The parking fine itself was a trivial matter on the surface, a minor inconvenience in the grand scheme of her life. But the moment she had received notice of the inflated penalty, something about it had felt off. The tone of the letter, the lack of proper documentation, and the unusually aggressive language had all raised red flags. It wasn't just a clerical error, it was a pattern she had seen too many times before. And now, standing before Judge Whitman, she could see the larger picture unfolding. Whitman was known for his subtle but pointed bias. He rarely crossed the line into overt discrimination. He was too smart for that, but his rulings often carried an unmistakable slant. Higher fines for certain defendants, harsher sentences, a tone that tricked with disdain when addressing people who didn't fit his idea of respectable. Janice had reviewed enough case files to recognize the pattern, and while today wasn't about proving his history, it was hard to ignore how this moment was part of something much bigger. In the gallery, the murmur of whispers continued, the audience unable to contain their curiosity. Among them was Marcus, a young black man who had been waiting for his case to be called. He leaned toward his sister, whispering, "Do you think she's gonna win?" His sister, Tasha, shrugged but kept her eyes on Janice. "I don't know, but she's got guts. You see the way she stood up to him. That's not something you see every day." Marcus nodded, his admiration evident. "It's about time someone did." Their quiet exchange was echoed throughout the room, the crowd captivated by Janice's presence and the unfolding drama. For many, this wasn't just about a parking fine or a courtroom procedure. It was about seeing someone challenge a system they had long felt powerless against. Janice had become, in that moment, a symbol of resistance. Meanwhile, behind the bench, Whitman's frustration simmered. He shuffled papers on his desk, his mind racing to find a way to regain control. The evidence Janice had presented was airtight, but admitting as much would mean acknowledging his own misstep. And worse, it would set a precedent he wasn't willing to entertain. If he let her win, what message would that send? That his authority could be questioned? That the system could bend under scrutiny? No, he couldn't allow that. In a calculated move, he addressed the court. "I will review the evidence further and issue a ruling tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned for today." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, signaling the end of the session, but the tension didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened. People began filing out of the courtroom, their conversations hushed but animated. Janice gathered her things, her expression calm, but her mind still sharp. She knew Whitman's delay tactic was meant to buy him time, but she wasn't worried. The truth was on her side, and she had no intention of letting this end quietly. As she stepped into the hallway, she was approached by a familiar face. It was Sarah, a fellow attorney and longtime friend, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail. Sarah's expression was a mix of concern and admiration. "Janice," she said, lowering her voice, "that was intense. Are you okay?" Janice offered a small smile. "I'm fine. This isn't the first time I've dealt with someone like him." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, as if ensuring no one else was listening. "You know he's not going to let this go without a fight. Whitman doesn't like being challenged, especially not in front of a full courtroom." "I'm counting on it," Janice replied, her tone resolute. "He's going to show his hand, and when he does, I'll be ready." Sarah nodded, though her worry lingered. "Just be careful. You know how these things can escalate." Janice appreciated the concern, but she wasn't afraid. Her career had been built on taking risks and standing up to power. If anything, this was exactly the kind of fight she thrived on. As the day wore on, the story began to spread. By evening, whispers of the courtroom exchange had made their way through the legal community and beyond. Social media lit up with posts about the chief prosecutor versus the judge, some recounting the events with awe, others questioning what would happen next. Among those paying close attention was a local journalist named Daniel Hayes. Known for his investigative reporting, Daniel had been following complaints about Judge Whitman for months. He had heard stories of unfair rulings, of defendants who felt they had been targeted, but he hadn't been able to gather enough evidence to build a solid case. Until now. Daniel sat at his desk, poring over court records and news clippings, piecing together a timeline of Whitman's decisions. Janice's case was the spark he had been waiting for, and he was determined to dig deeper. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had saved weeks ago. "Ms. Carter," he said when she answered. "This is Daniel Hayes with the Gazette. I was in the courtroom today, and I'd like to speak with you about what happened. I think there's a bigger story here." Janice hesitated. She wasn't one to court media attention, but the opportunity to shine a light on systemic issues was too important to ignore. "I'll think about it," she replied cautiously. "But right now, I need to focus on the case." Daniel respected her decision, but he wasn't deterred. He had a feeling this was only the beginning, and he intended to be ready when the story broke wide open. As the night deepened, Janice sat in her home office, reviewing every detail of the case. The parking fine, the lack of notice, the court's mishandling of her payment. It was all there, laid out in black and white. But this wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about holding the system accountable, about making sure that people like Whitman couldn't continue to operate unchecked. The next morning, as she prepared to return to court, Janice felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever felt silenced or dismissed. And no matter what Whitman threw her way, she was ready to face it head-on. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation the next morning, the tension in the air heavier than before. News of Janice's bold confrontation had spread far beyond those who were present the day before. It wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a battle of principles, one that had drawn the attention of people from all walks of life. The gallery was packed, with some spectators even standing in the aisles. Among them were reporters, community leaders, and curious onlookers eager to witness what would unfold. Janice walked in with her head high, her presence commanding respect. She carried herself with a calm confidence, her legal briefs in one hand and her phone in the other, the glow of a few messages from supportive colleagues lighting up the screen. She had spent the night preparing meticulously, going over every aspect of the case and every possible angle Whitman might use against her. She wasn't taking any chances. As she took her seat at the plaintiff's table, she noticed Marcus and Tasha from the previous day sitting in the gallery again. Marcus gave her a subtle nod of encouragement, and she returned it with a faint smile. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Judge Whitman entered the courtroom, his expression a carefully controlled mask of authority. But Janice could see through it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes flickered to the gallery before settling on her. It was clear he felt the weight of the moment. He wasn't just presiding over a case, he was trying to salvage his reputation. "Court is now in session," he announced, his voice firm but lacking its usual edge. "We will proceed with the matter of Ms. Janice Carter versus the City of Westville." Janice stood, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to submit additional evidence. This includes detailed records of all communications regarding the fine, as well as documentation of my payment and the city's acknowledgement of receipt. Whitman hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Submit them to the clerk," he said after a moment, gesturing toward the desk. The clerk collected the files, and Janice could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her. She was presenting more than just paperwork. She was laying the foundation for something much larger. She wasn't simply defending herself. She was exposing the cracks in a flawed system. As the proceedings continued, Whitman attempted to regain control, interrupting Janice's arguments with pointed questions and dismissive remarks. But Janice was unshakable. She countered each interruption with measured responses, her tone respectful but firm. The more he tried to undermine her, the more evident it became that he was grasping at straws. The tension in the room reached a boiling point when Janice introduced a key piece of evidence, a series of internal emails from the city's parking division. The emails, obtained through a public records request, revealed a disturbing pattern of arbitrary fines and penalties disproportionately affecting certain neighborhoods. Whitman's expression darkened as the emails were read aloud, the implications clear to everyone in the room. "Your Honor," Janice said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "these emails demonstrate a systemic issue, one that raises serious questions about the fairness and transparency of the city's practices. This case is no longer just about me. It's about accountability." The gallery erupted in whispers, the weight of her words rippling through the room. Whitman banged his gavel, his voice sharp. "Order in the court." But the damage was done. The crowd had seen enough to understand that this wasn't just a personal dispute. It was a fight for justice that resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions. What would Whitman do now? Would he acknowledge the evidence and admit wrongdoing? Or would he double down in an effort to protect his position? As the gavel fell once more, signaling a recess, Janice felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She had pushed the case to its breaking point, but the outcome was still uncertain. The courtroom emptied slowly, the crowd buzzing with speculation and anticipation. Outside, reporters gathered, their cameras and microphones ready to capture the fallout. Janice stepped into the hallway, her mind racing. She knew the stakes had never been higher, and the next steps would determine not only the outcome of the case but also the future of her career and the broader fight for justice. As she prepared for the next phase, she couldn't shake the feeling that the climax was just around the corner, and the real battle was yet to come.